Stalingrad, Soviet Union, December 1942. Private Volkova's final transmission lasted 47 seconds. In it, she whispers that Sergeant Krezin promised the heart would taste warm. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you the truth about what men become when winter strips away everything but hunger. The Battle of Stalingrad had already claimed over 1 million lives by December 1942. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing soldiers where they stood. Both Soviet and German forces documented cases of cannibalism among starving troops, yet one unit's disappearance was deliberately obscured from official records. Soviet archive entry 42S contained a single line: Reconnaissance Unit 17B, status, missing, presumed frost casualties. The file was sealed within hours, stamped with classifications that remained untouched for 55 years. No search was ordered, no recovery attempted. Lieutenant Alexei Morozov received his orders at 400 hours in a bombed basement serving as temporary command. Major Volkov's breath formed ice crystals as he spoke, pointing to a crude map of the sewer system beneath Red October Factory. German communication cables run through these tunnels. Volkov explained, "Your unit enters through access point 7, follows the main passage eastward, locates and cuts the cables. 70, 2 hours maximum. Radio silence after descent." Morozov studied the hand-drawn schematic, noting penciled X marks indicating German positions above. The factory district had been contested for weeks, with control shifting building by building. Underground movement offered the only safe passage through the killing fields. Volunteers only, Volkov added, though in Stalingrad the distinction between volunteering and following orders had dissolved long ago. Within an hour, Morozov assembled his team. Sergeant Yegor Kresin, a Finnish campaign veteran whose pale eyes seemed fixed on distant horizons. Private Anya Volkova, their radio operator, whose steady hands had guided countless artillery strikes. Privates Dmitry Petrov and Viktor Semenov, recent conscripts proven reliable under fire. They gathered equipment in pre-dawn darkness: submachine guns, ammunition, 3 days of emergency rations, rope, flashlights, and Volkova's radio set. Each soldier carried specialized gear, though in Stalingrad's brutal arithmetic, every ounce had to justify its presence. As they prepared to descend through the frozen access hatch, Volkova made her final transmission. Her normally steady voice carried a slight tremor she attributed to cold. "Control, this is Recon 17B. Descending now. Snowstorm above. We'll go quiet." The response crackled through static. "Acknowledged, 17B. Good hunting." Morozov dropped through the hatch first, boots splashing into ankle-deep slush formed from melted snow filtering through street cracks above. The air felt marginally warmer underground, though darkness pressed against their flashlight beams with physical weight. One by one, his soldiers joined him in the depths. The tunnel stretched ahead into blackness, brick walls glistening with moisture that would freeze within hours. None spoke about the strange scratching sounds that seemed to follow their footsteps, or how their flashlight beams appeared to bend in the tunnel corners. Behind them, the access hatch sealed with a metallic clang that resonated through the passages like the closing of a tomb. If that descent into darkness already has your heart racing, you're going to want to buckle in for what comes next. Hit subscribe and ring that bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how deep this nightmare goes. Now, let's see what Unit 17B found in those tunnels. The tunnels beneath Stalingrad stretched like arteries through a frozen corpse. Water dripped steadily from cracked ceiling pipes, each drop echoing through the darkness with metronomic precision. The sound should have been comforting, a sign of life in the dead city above. Instead, it felt like a countdown. Private Semenov walked point, his flashlight beam cutting through the blackness 15 meters ahead of the group. The young conscript had volunteered for the position, claiming his night vision was better than the others. What he hadn't mentioned was how the darkness seemed to whisper his name. Contact. Semenov's voice crackled through the silence, barely above a whisper. The unit froze. Morozov hand-signaled for weapons ready as they approached Semenov's position. What they found made Krezin curse under his breath in Finnish. A German scout lay sprawled against the tunnel wall, his field-gray uniform dark with frozen blood. The man's throat had been cut with surgical precision, but that wasn't what made Volkova's breath catch in her throat. The soldier's ribcage had been cracked open like a book, ribs spread wide to expose the empty cavity within. Clean cuts, methodical, professional. No bullet wounds, Morozov observed, kneeling beside the corpse. Knife work, close quarters. Krezin examined the body with the clinical detachment of a veteran. Ribs were broken from the inside out, he said, running his finger along the fractured bone. Someone was looking for something specific. The German's dog tags were missing, but more disturbing was the expression frozen on his face. Not pain or fear, but something approaching gratitude, as if his death had been a relief. "Sir," Petrov called from further down the tunnel, "you need to see this." 20 meters ahead, the tunnel walls bore fresh scratches, gouged deep into the brick. The marks formed crude shapes, humanoid figures with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to be all teeth. They covered a 10-meter stretch of wall, growing more frantic and desperate as they progressed. Volkova aimed her flashlight at the carvings, her hand trembling slightly. "These weren't made with tools," she whispered. "Look at the depth, the spacing." The scratches were too wide for fingernails, too deep for desperate clawing. They suggested something else entirely, something with longer, sharper appendages that could tear through brick like wet clay. "German work," Krezin said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Psychological warfare." Morozov studied the carvings more closely. At the end of the sequence, barely visible in the flashlight's glow, someone had scratched a single word in Cyrillic letters: warm. The word had been carved over and over, each repetition more violent than the last, until the final iteration was gouged so deep that mortar fragments littered the tunnel floor below. "We keep moving," Morozov ordered, though something in his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his men. "Standard formation. Semenov. Maintain point." As they advanced deeper into the tunnel system, none of them noticed that the Germans' frozen blood had begun to steam in the frigid air, or that the scratches on the walls seemed to shift and writhe when viewed through peripheral vision. Behind them, in the darkness they had left, something began to hum a lullaby in a language that predated both Russian and German. The melody was beautiful, haunting, and utterly wrong in the depths beneath a city of the dead. Private Semenov's flashlight beam wavered as he walked, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw his own reflection in the tunnel walls. But the reflection was smiling, and Semenov knew he wasn't. 6 hours into their descent, Private Petrov simply wasn't there anymore. It happened between one breath and the next. Volkova had been adjusting her radio frequency, trying to cut through the interference that seemed to grow stronger the deeper they went. When she looked up, 4 flashlight beams swept the tunnel instead of 5. "Where's Petrov?" Morozov's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. They retraced their steps, calling his name in harsh whispers that echoed off the wet brick walls. Nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sound of a body hitting water. It was as if the darkness had simply swallowed him whole. "He was right behind me," Semenov insisted, his young face pale in the flashlight glow. "I heard his breathing. I heard his boots splashing." Krezin examined the tunnel floor with methodical precision. No drag marks, no blood, no signs of struggle. He straightened, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been fear. Men don't just disappear. But in the sewers beneath Stalingrad, apparently they did. They found Petrov's helmet floating in a side passage 20 meters from where he'd vanished. The metal was dented inward, as if crushed by enormous pressure. but there was no blood inside. More disturbing were the long scratches scored across its surface, matching the claw marks they'd seen on the tunnel walls. Volkova picked up the helmet with trembling hands. "It's still warm," she whispered. The radio on her back crackled with sudden static, and through the white noise came something that made them all freeze. A voice speaking Russian with perfect military diction. "The ice is listening. The ice remembers." It was Petrov's voice. "Dmitri?" Morozov keyed his throat mic. "Petrov, respond. What's your position?" The static intensified, then cleared. "So cold here, Lieutenant, but they showed me how to stay warm, how to find warmth in the dark." Volkova's hands flew over her radio controls, trying to triangulate the signal. "It's coming from everywhere," she said, her voice barely controlled. "The transmission is bouncing through the entire tunnel system. Petrov, this is a direct order. Report your location immediately." Laughter echoed through their headsets, but it wasn't quite right. Too many teeth in the sound, too much hunger. "I can see you, Lieutenant. I can see all of you. The scratching ones showed me how to see in the dark, how to taste fear." Krezin grabbed the radio from Volkova's hands. "Petrov, you're experiencing hypothermia, induced hallucinations. We're coming to get you. They're so beautiful when they're afraid." The voice continued, no longer sounding entirely like Petrov. "The way your hearts beat faster, the way your breath fogs in the cold. I can smell it through the walls." The transmission cut to static, then silence. For long minutes, none of them spoke. They stood in a circle, flashlights pointed outward, listening to the steady drip of water and their own ragged breathing. The tunnel felt different now, as if they were being observed by hungry eyes hidden in every shadow. "Equipment malfunction," Morozov finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Radio interference from the battle above." But they all knew the truth. They'd heard the genuine terror in Petrov's voice before it changed into something else. Something that had learned to use his vocal cords, but hadn't quite mastered human speech patterns. As they resumed their advance through the tunnels, none of them mentioned the wet footprints that appeared in their flashlight beams. Prints that matched Soviet-issue boots, but were accompanied by longer, deeper impressions that suggested claws. Behind them, in the darkness they'd left, something that had once been Private Petrov watched with eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator. It was learning patience, learning to hunt. And it was still so very, very cold. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent, as if the tunnel itself was trying to warn them. But warnings, like prayers, rarely reached the dead in time. By the second day, their rations were gone. Not eaten, gone. Someone had torn through their packs during the night while they slept in shifts, shredding the canned meat and hardtack into inedible scraps. The thief had been careful, methodical, leaving just enough evidence to ensure they'd know it was deliberate. Semenov discovered the sabotage first, his young face crumpling as he held up shredded packaging. "Everything's ruined, even the emergency chocolate." Krezin examined the damage with the detachment of a man who'd survived the Finnish winter. Cut with something sharp, multiple blades, parallel incisions. His pale eyes met Morozov's. This wasn't an animal. The lieutenant felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. They were 3 days from their extraction point, with no food and dwindling ammunition. Above ground, the Battle of Stalingrad raged with mechanical fury. Below, something else was hunting them with patient intelligence. "We continue the mission," Morozov decided. "Locate the German cables, complete the sabotage, extract through secondary route." But even as he spoke, he could see the change beginning in his men's eyes. That hollow look he'd witnessed in siege survivors, when civilization's thin veneer started to crack under pressure. Volkova was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Sir, we haven't seen Petrov's body. What if he's still alive down here? What if he's the one who destroyed our food?" The question hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. If Petrov was alive, if he'd turned against them, then every shadow might conceal a former comrade twisted by cold and hunger into something unrecognizable. Then we find him, Crescent said quietly, and we put him down like a rabid dog. They moved deeper into the tunnel system, following the crude map toward their objective. But the passages seemed different now, walls closing in despite maintaining the same dimensions. The scratching sounds grew more frequent, more aggressive, as if whatever made them was growing bolder. It was Semenov who first noticed the bones. Human remains, scattered throughout a side passage like discarded meal scraps, Soviet uniforms, German field gray, civilian clothing, all picked clean with surgical precision. The skulls showed evidence of systematic cracking, as if someone had been extracting the contents with practiced skill. How many? Morozov asked, though he dreaded the answer. Volkova counted silently, her lips moving. 17 that I can identify, maybe more. Krezin knelt beside a particularly fresh skeleton, wearing German insignia. This one's recent, still has cartilage connecting the joints. He looked up at them with dead eyes. Someone's been feeding down here for weeks. The radio crackled to life without warning, Petrov's voice drifting through the static like smoke. So hungry, Lieutenant. So very hungry. But I found a way to stay warm. Found a way to fill the emptiness inside. This time, the voice was different. Stronger. More confident. Less human. The scratching ones taught me the secret. About hearts. About what they contain when fear stops them beating. About the warmth that lives inside marrow. Volkova's hands shook as she tried to trace the signal. It's moving. The transmission is mobile, circling us. Join me, Petrov's voice continued, now carrying harmonics that no human throat should produce. Let me show you how good it feels to be full, how wonderful it is to never be cold again. The transmission ended with the sound of wet chewing, magnified and distorted until it filled their headsets with nauseating clarity. In the silence that followed, they heard new sounds echoing through the tunnels. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with inhuman coordination, and underneath it all, a sound that made their blood freeze in their veins. Humming, the same lullaby they'd heard before, but now sung by multiple voices in perfect, impossible harmony. Sergeant Krezin made his choice during the third night, when Semenov returned from scouting ahead. The young private stumbled into their makeshift camp, eyes wide with terror and something else. Something that made Volkova instinctively reach for her sidearm. Semenov's uniform was torn, revealing long scratches across his chest, but the wounds weren't bleeding. Instead, they wept a clear fluid that steamed in the frigid air. They spoke to me, Semenov whispered, his voice carrying that same harmonic distortion they'd heard in Petrov's transmissions. They showed me things, beautiful things about warmth and fullness. Morozov stepped forward, hand on his pistol grip. Victor, you need medical attention. Those wounds are infected. But Semenov smiled, and his teeth seemed longer than before. Sharper. Not infected, Lieutenant. Improved. Enhanced. They showed me how to stop being hungry, how to stop being cold. That's when Krezin moved. The veteran's knife found Semenov's throat with practiced precision, opening the carotid artery in a single fluid motion. But instead of blood, something thick and black poured from the wound, hissing where it struck the tunnel floor. Semenov continued smiling, even as he collapsed, his lips moving soundlessly around words that hurt to hear. His body convulsed once, then went still, but his eyes remained open, tracking their movements with predatory interest. He wasn't one of us anymore, Krezin said, wiping his blade clean. His pale eyes held no remorse, only the cold calculation of a survivor. Look at his fingernails. Volkova aimed her flashlight at Semenov's hands and immediately wished she hadn't. His fingernails had grown into claws, curved and yellowed like old bone. Beneath them, Fragments of brick and mortar were embedded deep in the flesh. Jesus Christ, Morozov breathed. Krezin was already moving, dragging Semenov's body toward a side passage. We can't leave him here. The smell will attract others. But as he lifted the corpse, Semenov's head lolled back, and his mouth fell open, revealing a throat lined with additional teeth. Rows of them, spiraling down into darkness, like the inside of a lamprey's maw. Volkova vomited into the tunnel water, the sound echoing obscenely in the confined space. What is this? What's happening to us? Krezin continued his grim work, propping Semenov's body against the tunnel wall in a sitting position. Survival, he said simply. Darwin's law in its purest form. Then, with movements too quick and practiced to be improvised, Krezin drew his knife again and began systematically butchering the corpse. His technique was surgical, efficient, removing strips of meat with the skill of a field medic. "Yegor, what are you doing?" Morozov demanded, raising his weapon. Krezin looked up, his pale eyes reflecting their flashlight beams like mirrors. "Staying alive, Lieutenant. Staying warm." He held up a piece of flesh, examining it critically. "The transformation changes the meat, makes it nutritious, filling in ways regular food never was." He bit into the raw flesh, chewing slowly, deliberately. Steam rose from his mouth as he swallowed, and for the first time in days, color returned to his cheeks. "It tastes like warmth," he said, offering them strips of meat with genuine generosity, like coming inside from the cold, like mother's cooking on Christmas morning. Volkova backed away, her radio equipment clattering against the tunnel wall. "You're insane. You're all insane." But even as she spoke, she could feel her own stomach cramping with hunger, could smell the rich, metallic aroma rising from Krezin's meal. And despite every rational thought screaming in protest, her mouth began to water. In the distance, multiple voices began humming again, closer now, patient, waiting. They knew it was only a matter of time. Lieutenant Morozov cracked 3 hours after Krezin finished his meal. It started with the humming. First, Krezin joined the distant chorus, his voice blending seamlessly with the others echoing through the tunnel system. Then Morozov began moving his lips, unconsciously mouthing the melody while his eyes grew distant and unfocused. Volkova watched in horror as her commanding officer's humanity slowly drained away, replaced by something patient and predatory. His breathing changed first, becoming deeper, more deliberate. Then his posture shifted, shoulders hunching forward as if preparing to pounce. "Sir?" she whispered, but Morozov didn't respond. He was listening to something she couldn't hear, tilting his head like an animal detecting prey. That's when she ran. Volkova fled deeper into the tunnel system, her radio equipment bouncing against her spine with each desperate step. Behind her, she could hear them following. Not the heavy boots of Soviet soldiers, but something lighter, more graceful, the sound of things that had learned to move silently through the dark. She found refuge in a maintenance chamber, a cramped space barely large enough for one person. Her hands shook as she activated her radio, cycling through frequencies until she found the emergency channel. "Control, this is Private Volkova, Reconnaissance Unit 17B, emergency transmission. Please respond." Static answered her, but underneath the white noise she could hear breathing, multiple sources surrounding her position. "They're not human anymore," she whispered into the microphone, her voice barely audible above her ragged breathing. "The cold changed them. The hunger changed them. Lieutenant Morozov, Sergeant Krezin, they're hunting me." She paused, listening to footsteps in the corridor outside. Slow, methodical steps accompanied by that horrible humming. "I can hear them moving through the walls. They know where I am. They're waiting for me to make a mistake, to show weakness." Her flashlight began to dim, the battery dying after days of constant use. In the growing darkness, She could see shapes moving beyond the chamber entrance. Tall, gaunt figures with elongated limbs and faces that reflected light like animals. "Oh God," she breathed into the radio. "They're smiling. They're all smiling and their mouths are wrong. Too many teeth. Too much hunger." A gentle tapping began on the chamber walls. Patient, rhythmic, like fingernails on glass, but deeper, more substantial. The sound of claws scraping against metal. Krezin said it was warm inside. Volkova continued, her voice becoming more frantic. "He said when you chew the heart, when you taste the fear, it fills the emptiness, makes the cold go away forever." The tapping intensified, coming from all directions now. They had surrounded her completely. "I understand now why they're waiting. They want me to choose. They want me to come to them willingly, to accept the gift they're offering." Her radio crackled, and through the static came a familiar voice. Lieutenant Morozov, but changed, enhanced. "Anya, why are you hiding? We found such beautiful warmth down here, such perfect fullness. You'll never be cold again." Krezin's voice added, harmonizing perfectly with Morozov's. "You'll never be empty. We can teach you to see in the dark, to taste emotions on the air." A third voice joined them. Petrov, but not as she remembered him. "The ice remembers everything, Anya. Every fear, every pain, every moment of desperation. Let us show you how to forget." Volkova's breathing became ragged, panicked. The chamber walls seemed to be closing in, though she knew it was impossible. "They're in my head now," she whispered to her radio. "I can feel them scratching at my thoughts, showing me images of warmth, of satisfaction, of how good it feels to never be hungry again." The voices outside began to sing, that same lullaby but with words now, words in a language that predated Russian, predated civilization itself. Words that spoke directly to the primitive brain, to the part that remembered when humans were prey. "I can't hold out much longer," Volkova admitted, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The song is so beautiful, so welcoming. They're promising me that I'll understand everything once I join them, once I let them in." Her final words were barely audible above the growing chorus. "Tell them we completed the mission. Tell them the cables are cut. But don't tell them about the warmth. Don't tell them how good it feels when the hunger finally stops." The transmission ended with the sound of metal being torn apart, followed by breathing that was no longer entirely human. The recovered transmission tape surfaced 55 years later, discovered by urban explorers mapping the abandoned sewer system beneath modern-day Volgograd. Soviet records showed the tunnels had been sealed in 1953 with concrete barriers marked "Structural instability, do not enter." The official explanation never mentioned the additional warnings. Scrawled in multiple languages, "Not for human recovery." Dr. Mikhail Petrov, no relation to the missing private, worked as an archivist for the Federal Security Service when the tape reached his desk in 2001. His job was cataloging declassified materials from the Great Patriotic War, mundane work involving supply requisitions and troop movements. Volkova's transmission was different. It carried classification markings he'd never seen before, stamps that predated modern bureaucracy. He listened to the 47-second recording 17 times that first night, headphones pressed tight against his ears in his cramped Moscow apartment. The static was heavy, distorting much of the audio, but certain phrases came through with crystalline clarity. Phrases about warmth, about hunger, about the satisfaction found in places where satisfaction should not exist. Petrov began having dreams. In them, he walked through frozen tunnels beneath a burning city, following voices that sang in harmonies no human throat should produce. The dreams were vivid, tactile, filled with sensory details his conscious mind couldn't possibly know. The precise echo of footsteps on wet brick, the metallic taste of fear on winter air, the way human flesh steamed when exposed to extreme cold. he started digging, first through official archives, cross-referencing unit designations and casualty reports. Reconnaissance Unit 17B existed in the records, but their final disposition was listed as administrative error, unit never deployed. 5 names erased from history with bureaucratic efficiency. Then he began physical excavation. Petrov's neighbors in the apartment building called the police after 3 weeks of constant digging sounds from his flat. They found him in his kitchen, having torn through 2 walls with his bare hands, fingernails worn to bloody stubs. He was searching for something, they said, following sounds that led deeper into the building's foundation. They promised it would be warm inside, he kept repeating to the officers who restrained him. They showed me how to find the warmth, how to taste the fear. The coroner listed cause of death as starvation-induced psychosis, though Petrov's stomach contents puzzled the medical examiner. Traces of human tissue, somehow preserved despite being consumed weeks earlier. Tissue that had been cooked at temperatures the human digestive system couldn't produce. More troubling were the scratch marks found throughout Petrov's apartment. Gouges in the walls that matched no known tool, arranged in patterns that suggested desperate urgency. The final message, carved deep into his bedroom wall in letters 2 inches high, read simply, "Listening." The transmission tape disappeared from evidence storage 3 days after Petrov's death. Security footage showed no one entering or leaving the archive room, but the recording was gone, leaving only an empty case and a note written in Cyrillic, "The ice remembers." Modern satellite imagery of the Stalingrad sewer system reveals thermal anomalies in the sealed sections, areas where ground temperature remains consistently higher than surrounding zones. Local authorities attribute this to residual industrial heat from wartime manufacturing, though the factories in question were destroyed in 1942. Sometimes, during particularly harsh winters, residents of Volgograd report hearing sounds from storm drains and sewer grates, humming, rhythmic tapping, voices calling in languages that sound almost familiar, promising warmth to those willing to listen. The tunnels remain sealed, the warnings remain posted, and in the depths beneath the city, patient things continue their eternal hunt, singing lullabies to the living while they wait for winter to drive the hungry down into darkness. After all, they have learned that the best prey comes willingly. If this transmission from the War Maestro archive left you listening for scratches in the walls, then it's time to enlist in our ranks. Check your emergency rations, make sure they're still intact, and subscribe to uncover more classified horrors from history's darkest conflicts. Hit that notification bell like your life depends on it. You'll want advance warning when our next sealed file breaks open. Share this story with fellow historians of the macabre who understand that the most terrifying battles aren't always fought above ground. Remember, some tunnels should never be reopened, but some stories demand to be told.